31. The Assyrian tablets and other inscriptions. With the expansion of the British Empire in the 19th century, British and European archaeologists could explore the Near East in earnest. They found thousands of Mesopotamian inscriptions, and these inscriptions showed that the Assyrians called the Israelites Cimmerians. When this information was cross-referenced with ancient classics, it was clear that the Cimmerian Israelites were connected to the Scythians, Sake, Celts, Gauls, and the Germanic tribes. This important information took decades to piece together, and even now most of our kin are not aware of it, and that is largely due to AntiChrist lurking in the background, always trying to suppress and discredit these discoveries. The first significant group to undertake the task of spreading these discoveries was British Israel, a newly formed Christian denomination in Britain. Unfortunately, and perhaps dishonestly, they insisted that only the British people were the 12 tribes of Israel. All other European groups were excluded, and this is patently ridiculous because the British people themselves are of the same race as the Germanic tribes and other Europeans. In fact, the Anglo-Saxons are merely an offshoot of the Anglo-Saxons who remained in Germany and became the dominant tribe and formed the Holy Roman Empire. So when the British Empire began to decline, certain American Christians updated British Israel to include Americans, while some rightfully included all Europeans. Regardless, all of these new branches, including the original, were guilty of the same basic error, and this error was poisonous. Both groups believed the lie that the modern people who call themselves Israelites are in fact the tribe of Judah, and Britain and America as the other 11 tribes. But the Antichrist who claim to be the Israelites are in fact the descendants of Cain. The Europeans are the 12 tribes of Israel. Now we shall set this error straight once and for all. So starting with the inscriptions, we will use the book Ancient Near Eastern Texts relating to the Old Testament, as it compiles all of the significant inscriptions. So firstly, we'll compare the inscriptions to ancient Greek history, starting with Herodotus. Herodotus described the armies commanded by Xerxes, the Persian king. As he says, the Sake or Scyths were clad in trousers and had on their heads tall stiff caps rising to a point. They bore the bow of their country and the dagger, besides which they carried the battle axe or sagaris. They were in truth American Scythians, but the Persians called them Sake, since that is the name which they gave to all Scythians. Here he boasts of all the provinces which he rules over. Whilst it is not particularly relevant, it shows the sheer scale of the Persian Empire, from Egypt to India to the coast of Anatolia. But towards the end, what is interesting as he lists the American Cimmerians. However, the inscription was trilingual, meaning it was written in 3 languages side by side. Firstly, you had the Assyrian language, which was Akkadian. Then you had the Aramaic language, the language of Aram. And then finally, you had the Persians' native language, Elam, because they were from Elam. In Assyrian, they are called Cimmerians, but in Aramaic and Elam, they are listed as Sakans or Sake. The Cimmerians or Scythians or Sake wearing the pointed caps. So here we realize that the Cimmerians, the Sake, and the Scythians are all the same people, just different names from different cultures, and we came from these people and we originated in the Near East. Next, we shall have a look at an inscription from Sargon II, who presumably ruled Assyria from 721 BC to 705 BC, and his conquest addressed the northern kingdom of Israel. So there's a few gaps in this, but from here we see he besieged Samaria and deported 27,290 people. He settled other people in the land of Samaria, and he placed an officer of his as governor over Samaria and imposed tribute. So this fully corroborates the account in the Bible. Samaria endured a long siege but was eventually defeated, and this is recorded in 2 Kings. So in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, so that would be the southern kingdom, that's when Hosea, the son of Elah, began to reign. That's in the northern kingdom. But he did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came against him, and Hosea became his servant. So at this point, the rest of the northern kingdom had already been deported. So Samaria was still holding out, but the northern kingdom was now much weaker, and the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hosea Hosea. So instead of turning to Yahweh and obeying his commands, instead he tried to get an alliance with Egypt. Obviously this is not gonna work. So the king of Assyria comes and shuts him up and bounds him in prison. And he besieged Samaria for 3 years, and then finally he took it and carried away all the remaining Israelites of the northern kingdom. And here we find out that they were placed up north in Halah Habar by the river of Gozan, so that's just under the Caucasus Mountains, and also in the cities of the Medes. Up to now we see that most of the people of the tribes of ancient Israel, i.e. the northern kingdom, were destroyed or taken captive by the Assyrians, but now Judah, the southern kingdom, would suffer the same fate. So firstly in 2 Kings we have an account of the Assyrian captivity of much of Judah. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib king of Assyria come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah king of Judah sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish, saying, I have offended, return from me. That which thou puttest on me will I bear. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah king of Judah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of Yahweh and in the treasures of the king's house. At that time did Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of Yahweh and from the pillars which Hezekiah king of Judah had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. Essentially Hezekiah bribed the king of Assyria, but this could not change Israel's destiny, which was captivity for their sins. From the inscriptions of Sennacherib III, who presumably ruled Assyria from 704 to 781 BC, we see the Assyrians returned and deported most of the Israelites from the southern kingdom and besieged Jerusalem. So he tells us he took 46 strong cities as well as walled forts and a countless amount of small villages in the vicinity, and he describes how he took them. He then tells us that he took 200,150 people, so that would be Judah and Benjamin, off into captivity, but he was unable to take Jerusalem, and he handed over the whole country, so that would be the whole southern kingdom except for Jerusalem, over to other tributary kings in the vicinity. So here we should note that there are 2 different perspectives on this incident. In the Assyrian inscription version, where it boasted that Hezekiah was left locked up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, that is political spin, so Sennacherib could depict himself in the best possible light. In reality, Yahweh annihilated his army to prevent Jerusalem from falling. A remnant had to remain in and around Jerusalem so that he could fulfill the prophecies of the coming of Christ. Therefore we see this version in Isaiah reads quite differently. Therefore thus saith Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shields, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith Yahweh. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake. Then the angel of Yahweh went forth and smote in the camp of Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib king of Assyria departed, and went and returned, and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adram-melech and Sharezer his son smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the lands of Armenia, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. So overall the Assyrians record that they had taken at least a few 100,000 people of Judah into captivity, but they were prevented from taking Jerusalem. Thus all 12 tribes of Israel were taken into the Assyrian captivity, except for the population of Jerusalem, which was likely quite large. Unfortunately, the term 10 tribes continued to get used for the Assyrian deportations, and the term 2 tribes continued to be used in reference to those who remained in Jerusalem. That is not the case. People from all 12 tribes went into captivity, but gradually the remainder in Jerusalem spread back into the Judean countryside before they were finally taken captive by the Babylonians just over 100 years later. The Assyrian inscriptions prove that all events recorded in the Bible really did happen. The Bible is not a fairy tale. It's not historical fiction as the AntiChrist tried to make us believe. It is real and all about us, the Europeans. 32. The historian Josephus and where he locates the lost tribes. The ancient historian Flavius Josephus was a Judean and a Pharisee. He also served as a general within the Judean armies in their fight against Rome. He was born after Christ and was alive to experience the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He wrote several books that are highly valuable to us today and give us much insight. Firstly, he fills in the gap between the Maccabees and the coming of Christ. Roughly 200 BC to 0 BC, no biblical book was written from this period, so Josephus gives us some insight into the politics of Judea, including important background information concerning the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. He confirms that the deported 12 tribes were located across the Euphrates River to the north and east as the Scythians, Sacae, Parthians, and so forth. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, he explains the history of the descendants of Jacob's brother. These non-Israelites were integrated into Judea through forced conversion to the religion and customs of the Judeans. Eventually, the real Judeans would become Christians and lose their Israelite identity, but the descendants of Jacob's brother would ultimately always reject Christianity and from then on falsely claim to be the real Judeans. Eventually, over the years, their name changed. Originally, they claimed to be only the tribe of Judah, but now they claim to be all 12 Israelite tribes, and they continue this lie to this day. Of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essene sects, only the Essenes required their members to be racially pure Israelites, or as Josephus puts it, Judeans by birth. Since Josephus was of the tribe of Levi, he was accepted into the Essenes for a few years. However, later he joined the Pharisees instead, because the Essenes were completely excluded from political life within Judea. From this personal account of Josephus, we see that the Pharisees and Sadducees, whom Christ dealt with during his ministries, were not all racially Israelites. These sects accepted non-Israelite converts, so if they weren't Israelites by birth, who were they? Would knowing their real identity help explain the contention Christ constantly faced from them? Josephus's history about Judea provides answers. The small number of Israelites who returned from Babylon consisted of members of the tribe of Judah, Levi, and Benjamin. They rebuilt the temple and country under the Persian Empire and then under Alexander the Great and the kingdoms of his successors. Eventually, the Judeans grew strong and became independent and prosperous. At this time, the descendants of Jacob's brother lived south of Israel in the land of Edom, and they continually attacked the Israelites. The Israelites fought to drive them out without lasting success, and also fought to expand their own territory. So Josephus recounts that around the 2nd century BC, the Israelites changed tactics. They began to use force and persuasion to convert the descendants of Jacob's brother to their religion, customs, and rites. So Josephus tells us that from then on they were also called Judeans, just like the original Judeans. Herod the Great was one such convert. He bribed Mark Antony, the Roman general, into making him king over the Judeans, and Josephus notes that Herod and his ambitious family were all descendants of Jacob's brother. Many others were appointed to be priests and even high priests. Thus we can understand why the largely non-Israelite religious establishment continuously hounded and harassed Christ, and why they sought to kill him. We can understand why they completely rejected Christianity. Christianity was never for them, and why Christ called them a race of vipers. Their forefather Esau had married into the race of Cain. Therefore his descendants were Canaanites. The religious elite of Christ's time and the modern so-called Israelites were and are Canaanites, not Israelites. Christ called them the Sin-A-Gog of Shaitan. This name indicates that they are the offspring of the fallen angels, and by their very nature are opposed to him and his Adamic creation. In Antiquities, Book 11, Josephus recorded that Ezra received an important letter from the Persian king Xerxes, and Ezra sent a copy to the Israelites in captivity, where Josephus wrote in part that Ezra was incredibly happy about receiving this letter, and for this reason he gave thanks to God. So he read the letter at Babylon to the Judahites, and he sent a copy to his own nation that were in Media. And then later we read that many went down to Jerusalem with him, but then the entire body of the people of Israel remained in that country. So Joseph explains that there are only 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, but the rest are all beyond the Euphrates till now, which he refers to as an immense multitude and not to be estimated by numbers. So here we see that the deported Israelites were indeed the Sake, Scythians, Parthians, etc., as only they were an immense multitude over the Euphrates River at that time. In Antiquities, Book 12, Josephus wrote that the Greek kings of Syria, the Seleucids, were meddling in the affairs of the high priest of Jerusalem, and even removed the certain priest from office and replaced him. Part of the reason for the troubles with the priest was a desire among some of them to Hellenize or adopt the Greek mode of living. Other priests adamantly opposed Hellenization, and Josephus mentions 2 priests named Jesus and Ananias who changed their names to Jason and Menelaus, and how they and others of their party had, as he said, retired to Antioch and informed him that they were desirous to leave the laws of their country and the Judean ways of living according to them. And he goes on to explain that a gymnasium was built at Jerusalem and that they were able to hide the circumcision of their genitals so that when they were naked they would appear to be Greeks. Now of course the Greeks were white and often blonde, so the Judeans certainly could not appear to be Greeks just by hiding their circumcision unless they were also genetically white. Overall, it's vital to note that whilst the books of Josephus may have been somewhat available to the early Christian churches in the Greco-Roman world, they were not available to the Germanic tribes who came to dominate all of Europe. Therefore, our Germanic ancestors would not have known this history of who was a true Israelite. Josephus wasn't translated into English until the early 18th century, so that means the true story of the descendants of Jacob's brother who came to pretend to be the true Israelites only became available to the European world relatively recently. The Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation, and Christendom as a whole would not have been aware of these facts, but now the historical proof has been made widely available, and we can know with certainty who the Israelites are and who are posing as Israelites but are not. 33. What we can learn from the ancient Greek and Roman historians. In the past, our schools taught authentic ancient history and many students studied the classics, but that's largely a thing of the past. These days, with political correctness, it deems ancient history and the classics as not acceptable, and instead of facts, students of all ages are force-fed a fabricated, new account of history in order to obscure reality. Now more than ever, it is imperative that we read the ancient historians of the Greco-Roman world in order to uncover the true history of our people and of the world. For example, we learn from these historians that in their days the Middle East was populated by European-looking people and largely remained so until the Arab conquest. But now that our people are no longer studying ancient history, most believe that the Middle East was always populated by the current people and their appearance. Therefore, they more readily accept the lie that the Israelites look just like Middle Eastern people today, and the majority of our people are stuck in this lie and cannot get out of it. So starting with perhaps the oldest historian that has survived, Homer lived in the mid to late 7th century BC, but he wrote about times long before his own, specifically the Trojan War in the early 12th century BC, and he described the nations that lived amongst and around the Greeks. Significantly, Homer never mentioned the Dorian Greeks. To him, they were just one of the many tribes that lived in Crete and not Greece, and the historian Thucydides stated that the Dorians were brought to Greece by the Heraclidae some 80 years after the Trojan War. Thus we can determine the truth of the letter from the king of Sparta, which was recorded in both Josephus and Maccabees, that the Dorians were in Crete because they were migrating from Palestine when the Trojan War occurred, and this migration took place in the middle of the Judges period in ancient Israel. Furthermore, when Homer described the characters in the Iliad, Peleus, the father of Achilles himself, and Menelaus, the king of Sparta, all had yellow hair. Hesiod also stated that Menelaus had golden hair in his catalogues of women, and he described Selene as white-armed and bright-dressed. He wrote that Demeter and Ganymedes were golden-haired in his Homeric hymns, as well as Polynice and Phaebad. Speaking of Thebes, the women of the city are described as being yellow or golden-haired in the plays with the tragic poets. In the Odyssey, the title character Odysseus had yellow hair, as did Rhinacimus, the son of Zeus, and the Phoenician Europa, the daughter of Phoenix. The wife of Odysseus, Penelope, had a complexion whiter than sawn ivory. When Homer imagined the goddess Aphrodite, who had protected her son Aeneas during the fighting at Troy, he wrote that she had thrown her 2 white arms about the body of her dear son. Juno, the imagined wife of Job, was frequently described as white-armed Juno. In both works, men are frequently described as turning pale with fear, so the heroes and even the gods themselves were all white. As for the historian Strabo, he gives us some extremely important information. He fully corroborates Josephus' accounts of the Judeans and the descendants of Jacob's brother living together after they had converted to the religion and customs of the Judeans. Even after their large-scale conversion, they lost their old name and became known as Judeans as well, and even Wikipedia admits this. Elsewhere, Strabo marveled that in Alexandria mixed races of people lived together in one city. From his reaction, we can assume that that phenomenon must have been rare in the ancient world. Speaking of Memphis in Egypt, he states that the city is large and populous. It ranks next to Alexandria, and like that place, is inhabited by mixed races of people. Now, since Strabo never remarked about this anywhere else in other descriptions of cities, this must have been specific to Egypt during his time, as even the historian Polybus had also attested. Strabo was also baffled that certain Syrians were referred to as white Syrians, and he commented sarcastically, as if there are any black ones. So if there were no non-white Syrians, then there are also no non-white Israelites. The biblical histories of Israel and Syria were inseparable, because from the time of David down to the time of Jeroboam too, Israel ruled over much of Syria. We also read in the words of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 26, "And thou shalt speak and say before Yahweh thy God, a Syrian ready to perish was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there with a few, and became there a nation, great, mighty, and populous." So understanding this, Abraham's kindred were originally from Pandaram in the northern westernmost parts of Syria, where Isaac and Jacob got their wives. Likewise, if the Phoenicians in Greece were blonde, then the Phoenicians of Carthage must have been blonde as well, and therefore the Phoenicians of Phoenicia in Palestine were blonde, because the only mongrelized cities known to Strabo were in Egypt. Both the Phoenicians and Carthaginians were white because they were Israelites. As for Diodorus Siculus, in his opening 3 history books, he described the founding myths, kings and cultures of North Africa, the Middle East, and as far as India and Scythia. When the work is read as a whole, it is clear that Diodorus Siculus believed these groups had much in common, not only in their religious beliefs and culture, but also in their general physical characteristics, and that's what you would expect in the Adamic world. They all originally descended from Noah and his 3 sons, so they would all look the same. However, the one exception was Ethiopia. He described 2 separate groups of Ethiopians, one highly civilized and another completely savage. Of the highly civilized, he wrote that the Ethiopians were the first to be taught to honor the gods and to hold sacrifices and the processions and festivals, etc., etc., and he goes on that many were actually educated in Greece. It becomes obvious that these Ethiopians, whose physical characteristics Diodorus failed to mention, were civilized and of the same stock as the rest of the Western society. But then, in stark contrast to the cultured Ethiopians, he describes various other groups living in Ethiopia, some of them dwelling in the land lying on both banks of the Nile and on the islands in the rivers, and some even in Arabia. The majority of them he describes as looking quite different, and here it is evident that Diodorus was describing the Nubians and other wandering tribes of the region. He continued, "As for their spirit, they are entirely savage and display the nature of a wild beast, and are as far removed as possible from human kindness to one another, and cultivated none of the practices of civilized life. They present a striking contrast when considered in the light of our own customs." It should be noted that in Ezekiel chapter 33 he lists Ethiopia among all the mingled people, and this fits well with the picture of a once Caucasian but then later adulterated Cush in that region. In Strabo's 17th book he gained further evidence that the Greco-Roman world was a European-looking world, with non-Adamics only on the fringes of society, especially in Egypt and Ethiopia. Strabo quoted Polybus and wrote, "Polybus at least, who visited the city Alexandria, was disgusted with its condition at the time. He says it is inhabited by three classes of people. First, the native Egyptians, an acute and civilized race. Secondly, by the mercenaries, a numerous, rough and uncultivated set, it being an ancient practice there to maintain a foreign armed force, with owing to the weakness of the kings, had learned rather to rule than to obey. And thirdly, there were the Alexandrians themselves, a people not generally civilized for the same reason, but still superior to the mercenaries, for though they are mongrels that came from a Greek stock, and had not forgotten their Greek customs." So overall, when we reflect on these historians' accounts, views, observations, experiences and perspectives, we see clearly that the Greeks and Romans were aware of the mongrel races that existed even in their day. At that time, these mixed people were confined to the far fringes of society, particularly in Egypt, Ethiopia and Arabia. But that would change. For example, the white Macedonians ruled and temporarily revived the great Egypt civilizations after Alexander's conquest, but they eventually became intermixed with the native Egyptians, and these native Egyptians, who originally were Adamics, had been mongrelized earlier by the Nubian invasions. Thus Egypt was doomed, and in the centuries that followed, more Adamic nations were mongrelized due to the Arab conquest, and these nations followed Egypt's fate. So we can learn all these facts and cautionary lessons from the ancient historians. No wonder they're not taught anymore. 34. Daniel's Beast Empires and where they ruled. The prophet Daniel gave an astonishing prophecy about the empires that would succeed Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. The very last empire would be the Germanic tribes, the Israelites, and they would inherit the world. Nowhere in the Old Testament is history foretold in such a clear manner. The last kingdom is a race of people, not a church as many modern biblical interpretations would have it. So King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and sought Daniel's interpretation, and we read this dream in Daniel chapter 2. So he saw a great statue, and the head was of fine gold, the breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, and the legs of iron, his feet part iron and part clay. And then the conclusion was that a stone that was cut without hands would smite the whole image upon its feet and break them to pieces. And then ultimately that stone that destroyed the statue, the stone that smote the image, became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So then Daniel gives his interpretation of the dream. He essentially explains that Nebuchadnezzar is the king of kings, and that God, Yahweh, has given him this kingdom and the power and the strength and the glory. He then explains that Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold, but his kingdom will not last forever and would be replaced by the kingdom of silver, and then that kingdom would be replaced by brass, and then that kingdom would be replaced. And then finally the last kingdom, made out of the feet and toes, would be replaced by the rock carved out from the mountain, and that kingdom is guaranteed to last forever. So firstly, for context, we need to look at Daniel's statement where he says, "Wheresoever the children of men dwell." The word for men here is not Adam, which refers specifically to the Adamic race. The word is Enosh, which means to men more generally. Evidently, not all the nations this beast would rule were Adamic. Then the prophecy states, "shall bear rule over all the earth," meaning that the scope of the rule is nevertheless limited to the Adamic world, not literally the whole world. The toes of the fourth part of the beast will crumble, because they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Here the word for men is once again Enosh. Hence we see that iron and clay represent two different types of men, Adamic and non-Adamic. The non-Adamic Enosh were the descendants of the Nephilim, the Kenites, Rephaim, Canaanites, and other mixed peoples. Now, since Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, then the other three parts of the beast kingdoms which would rise after him were the empires that succeeded him. The silver breast and arms were the Medo-Persian Empire, 2 arms for 2 tribes, which conquered and replaced Babylon. The brass belly and fires were the empires of Alexander, which conquered and replaced Persia. And the iron feet were the Roman Empire. Rome eventually split into 2 capitals, hence the 2 legs. The capitals were Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east. So when Rome fell, the Byzantine part was strong and the Roman part was weak. The 10 toes represent the 10 senatorial provinces of the Roman people during the time of the empire. In these provinces, action taken by the emperor had to be approved by the Roman Senate, because those provinces belonged to the Roman people. All other provinces were imperial provinces controlled exclusively by the emperor, as they had been conquered by the emperors. When Rome fell, the 10 toes crumbled, but much of the rest of the empire remained intact for longer under the Byzantines and the Germanic tribes. So for many centuries, apologists for Roman Catholic Church have offered misinterpretations in order to make the church itself the fifth empire or kingdom. But throughout the Bible, only the children of Israel were promised a new kingdom that would ultimately destroy and supplant the beast empires. The Roman Catholic Church did not destroy those empires, and certainly did not destroy the Western Roman Empire. Rather, the Catholic Church itself was a product of the Roman Empire itself. When we look for who contributed to and ultimately brought down and about the fall of Rome, we only see the Germanic tribes. These are the so-called Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, and others were indeed the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, which break in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. So only the Germanic people, and not the Roman Church, could be the fifth and last kingdom of Daniel's interpretation. One by one, the extremity and scope of the empires were gradually shifting west with each successive kingdom, and this was the result of the children of Israel gradually migrating westwards, whilst at the same time the other Adamic nations were gradually being mixed out of existence. Thus the Adamic world was moving wherever the children of Israel went, which was to Europe. The progression of empires westward went like this. Babylon ruled over the Middle East, Persia ruled the Middle East and Anatolia, whilst Alexander ruled Greece and the East. Rome ruled all of Europe and only parts of the East, and finally the Germanic tribes ruled only in Europe, and later they ruled the entire world. So overall, these empires never ruled any majority non-white nations. They did not rule over Africa, China, primitive America, and so on. At Rome's greatest extent during the time of Trajan in the early 2nd century, Rome ruled in Africa, but seldom more than a few hundred miles inland, so it is absurd to think that any non-Europeans were included in the statement that these empires would rule wheresoever the children of men dwell. Only white nations were the object of this prophecy, and these empires never ruled over other races. Furthermore, where it says, "in the days of these kings," we see the Germanic tribes migrating into Western Europe from the east in large numbers, and centuries later they would become known as Christendom. Taken together, all of these circumstances prove that our ancestors' identity is the people of God. We are Daniel's last kingdom that would become a great mountain and fill the whole earth. History proves that those predictions were fulfilled only by the European Israelites. 35. Jeremiah's reunion of Israel and Judah under the New Covenant. In the Old Testament, there are many promises and prophecies over and over again where Yahweh spoke of his intention to regather the dispersed Israelites. Israel and Judah were to be reunited. This regathering is also called the New Covenant in Jeremiah chapter 31, where he says, "Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband unto them, saith Yahweh. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith Yahweh. I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. Yahweh made the new covenant with the children of Israel in order to bring them back to himself. Paul of Tarsus actually cited this exact passage from Jeremiah in his epistle to the Hebrews in chapter 8, and in Romans chapter 9 he wrote that the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promises were for the Israelites, whom he called his kinsmen according to the flesh. Paul was writing around 58 AD, and Jeremiah had written centuries earlier, and both stated that the new covenant was exclusively only for the Israelites. Paul said in Acts chapter 26 that his purpose was for the hope of the 12 tribes. Therefore he brought the gospel specifically to white people in Europe. After his conversion on the road to Damascus, he spent 3 years in Arabia and never thought to preach to Arabians or Egyptians, or to go to Sudan or Ethiopia and preach to the other peoples there. Paul said he wanted to go west to Spain. He never once mentioned wanting to go east to India or China. But doesn't Scripture say that the gospel is for all the world? Here we should explain certain words and phrases Christ used which are twisted to make it seem that he opposed his own prophets and instead directed his message to all people and all races of the world. Throughout his ministry he uses phrases such as all, everyone, whoever, and the world. At the time of Christ's ministry, the Adamic world had been replaced by Israelites, so the Greco-Roman world was for the most part an Israelite world. Christ came from that world, thus where he says all and whoever, he is speaking in the context of that Israelite European world. When using context, someone can speak to a specific group and use terms such as all or anybody, but those words only apply to that specific group. For example, everyone needs to sign up for this meeting. Obviously, everyone does not apply to everyone in the entire world, but to people within the group being addressed, and this is exactly what Christ was doing. He came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel and was addressing only them. Paul wrote in Romans 14:11, "For it is written, as I live, saith Yahweh, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God." Later, Paul confidently stated that, "And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written." This means that every Israelite will eventually accept the gospel of Christ, whether in this life or the next. If people obey now, they have a reward waiting for them, as everyone will be judged and rewarded for their good works in this life. So Paul said to the Corinthians that when we die, if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. And this refers to the good deeds our kin do in this life. These good deeds will be stored up in heaven. All this tells us that Christianity is the new covenant, and its purpose is to regather the lost tribes, and this new covenant was only for the Israelites, and Christ was addressing them only. When the Europeans converted to Christianity, they were the lost sheep of the house of Israel, being regathered to their God. To say that Christ came for anyone and everyone is a type of universalism and is a lie. Universalism does not gather the lost sheep, rather it scatters them. 36. Ezekiel's remerging of the two sticks into one. Like Hosea and Jeremiah, Ezekiel made a remarkable prophecy about Israel's future. Yahweh would join two broken sticks into one whole stick. The broken sticks were an allegory for the divided kingdoms of Israel, and the prophecy shows that God can do the impossible. A mere man can't break a stick in two and then seamlessly join them together again. But Yahweh promised to rejoin the two broken sticks of Israel and Judah. the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom back together in one stick, and this would include all the dispersed Israelites from all the tribes, and this one stick represents Christendom. Under Christendom, the Israelites were reunited under Christ, who is Yahweh our God. In Ezekiel chapter 34, he gives a description of Yahweh's lost sheep who had wandered over the mountains, and Ezekiel was writing during the Israelites' captivity. They had been forced out of their land, had wandered, and were lost. And then later in Ezekiel chapter 35, it describes how the descendants of Jacob's brother took for himself the lands that Israel and Judah had been driven out of. Stealing the Israelites' land was an early step in the 500-year process of the descendants of Jacob's brother stealing our Israelite identity. And this Israelite identity continues to this day and confuses many, if not most, modern Christians. In Ezekiel chapter 36, he promises the reconciliation of Israel and continues to prophesy against Edom, the enemy who came to possess the ancient high places. And in verses 8 and 9 we read, "But ye, O mountains of Israel, ye shall shoot forth your branches, and yield your fruit to my people of Israel, for they are at hand to come. For behold, I am for you, and I will turn unto you, and ye shall be tilled and sown." He is speaking not of geographical mountains, but of the 12 tribes in captivity. And then after further promises of reconciliation with Israel, we arrive at Ezekiel chapter 37. And in this quite famous chapter, Ezekiel describes a valley of dry bones that come alive again. Allegorically, the lost tribes were walking corpses unless Christ came to save them, as it says in verses 11 to 12. "Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith Yahweh, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and cause you to come out of your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am Yahweh when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves, and shall put my spirit into you, and you shall live, and shall place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I, Yahweh, have spoken it, and performed it, saith Yahweh." In the days of Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, and Ezra, somewhere around 42,000 people from the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi returned to Jerusalem to build it with the permission of Cyrus the king. This was a small number of Yahweh's people, but Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and other post-captivity prophets make clear that Yahweh God knew where the rest of Israelites were. He had never abandoned them. The new covenant in Jeremiah was promised only to them, and here Ezekiel also speaks of this exclusive new covenant in the parable of the 2 sticks. So in chapter 37, Ezekiel gives the details. "The word of Yahweh came again unto me, saying, Moreover, thou son of man, take thee 1 stick, and write upon it, for Judah and for the children of Israel his companions. Then take another stick, and write upon it, for Joseph the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel his companions, and join them one to another into 1 stick, and they shall become one in thine hand. And when the children of Israel shall speak unto thee, saying, Wilt thou now show us what thou meanest by these? Say it unto them, Thus saith Yahweh God, Behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his fellows, and will put them with him, even with the stick of Judah, and make them 1 stick. And they shall be one in mine hand, and the sticks whereas thou writest shall be in thine hand before their eyes." About 1,000 years after Ezekiel had written this prophecy, the dispersed and lost tribes were reunited into 1 stick in Europe when they began to accept Christianity. Even though these European tribes had many wars with one another throughout history, they were nevertheless all Christians united in Christ, and were collectively known as Christendom. So continuing with Ezekiel, "And say unto them, Thus saith Yahweh God, Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen," or literally nations, "whither they be gone, and will gather them on every side, and bring them into their own land. And I will make them 1 nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel," so not Palestine, "and 1 king shall be king to them all, and they shall be no more 2 nations, neither shall they be divided into 2 kingdoms any more at all, neither shall they defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor of any of their transgressions, but I will save them out of all their dwelling places, wherein wherein they have sinned, and will cleanse them, so shall they be my people, and I will be their God. So the children of Israel, long after their captivity, would continue to be the people of God, and he mentions no other people here. They would be taken from among the other nations where they had been scattered, and once again become a distinct people under their God. Ezekiel describes this kingship of Christ allegorically as the kingship of David, who was a type of Christ in this regard. And David my servant shall be king over them, and they all shall have one shepherd. They shall all walk in my judgments, and observe my statutes, and do them, and they shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt. And they shall dwell therein, even they and their children's children forever, and my servant David shall be their prince forever. Then finally, Ezekiel gives the promise of a new covenant in Christ. Moreover, I will make a covenant of peace with them, and it shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will place them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore. My tabernacle also shall be with them. Yea, I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and the heathens, or nations, shall know that I am Yahweh, do sanctify Israel, when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them forevermore. So where it says the heathen shall know, the word for heathen is literally nations, and this could refer to the actual nations of Israel, or it could refer to the other Adamic nations, which was elsewhere promised a share in the resurrection. So the tribes of Israel and Judah were prophesied to become fully reunited in the gospel of Christ under a new covenant. But none of this includes the people of Judea who rejected Christ. Paul did not call them his kinsmen according to the flesh, but rather he explained that not all of them were of Israel, were actually Israelites. Furthermore, Yahweh never promised that Christianity would include any other people in the world. As we see over and over again, the new covenant of Christianity's sole purpose was the reunion of Israel and Judah, the regathering of Yahweh's people, who can only be the Europeans. 37. Isaiah's proof of Israel's destiny is in Europe. Isaiah is the most quoted prophet in the New Testament, and even Christ himself quoted Isaiah. He is often referred to as Esaias the prophet, no matter which part of his book is cited. A careful reading of Isaiah's prophecies show us that the children of Israel were destined to end up in Europe and become the Europeans. The first 40 chapters of Isaiah are concerned with the coming judgments upon Israel, Babylon, Assyria, and other surrounding nations, whilst the remainder of the book from chapter 41 onwards was given after the deportations, and these later chapters address the Assyrians' failed siege of Jerusalem, what would happen to the deported Israelites, as well as the coming Messiah, Christ. In the first 40 chapters, many interconnections between the prophets and recorded history proved that the Israelites were white, or more accurately, that they largely formed the stock that later became known as European or Caucasian. Isaiah chapter 2 makes reference to the ships of Tarshish and indicates that the Israelites were still engaged in Mediterranean trade with Europe, cross-referencing Ezekiel chapter 27 and 28, and the Lamentations over Tyre show that Dan and Javan traveled together and engaged in European trade from Tyre. In Isaiah chapter 10, 17 to 20, it foretells the destruction of Assyria and the significant part the Israelites would play in its destruction. And the lights of Israel shall be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame, and it shall burn and devour his thorns and his briers in one day, and shall consume the glory of his forest and of his fruitful field, both soul and body, and they shall be as when a standard-bearer fainteth, and the rest of the trees of his forest shall be few, that a child may write them. And it shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel, and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob, shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. Then Isaiah chapter 11, 10 to 14 prophesies the future of Israel after the destruction of Assyria and the regathering of all Israelites wherever they have wandered off to. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the nations seek, and his rest shall be glorious. And it shall come to pass in that day that Yahweh shall set his hand again, the second time, to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea, and he shall set upon an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim, and they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines towards the west, and they shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their hand upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. In that same chapter, verse 16, an important reference is made of the Israelites of both captivities. These were the Israelites who came out of the Exodus but didn't go with Moses, i.e. the Danaans and Trojans, as well as the Israelites who were deported by the Assyrians much later. And there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came out of the land of Egypt. Okay, so Nineveh fell in 612 BC, and the other cities of Assyria were destroyed by a coalition of Persians, Medes, Babylonians, and the Qumri or Cimmerians, who in some records are also called Sake or Scythians, but are the same people. Modern historians often severely try to play down the part of the Cimmerian Scythians played in this defeat of Assyria, or that they claim that the Cimmerians and Scythians came down from the north to attack Assyria. After the Assyrian Empire fell, many of the Cimmerians did not remain in Mesopotamia or Anatolia, but travelled west through Phrygia and Lydia in Anatolia and sacked cities of the Greeks before crossing the Bosphorus into ancient Thrace. And these Cimmerians were the Kimri of the Assyrian inscriptions. No records exist of any other dark-looking people taking part in the destruction of Nineveh. The Cimmerian Scythians must be the Israelites of Isaiah's prophecy, who would ultimately destroy the Assyrian Empire, which also confirms the archaeology revealing the origin of the Qumri, as well as the testimony of Josephus. In Isaiah chapter 13, 4, 5 and 17 we read a prophecy about the coming destruction of Babylon and the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. The noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. Yahweh of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. They come for a far country, from the end of heaven, even Yahweh, and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. Many of the Kimri, or Israelites, had been settled in the cities of the Medes by the Assyrians. As Assyrian power declined in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, the Persians became subject to the Medes, but under Cyrus the situation was reversed, and the Persians became the dominant partner. But many of the former Israelites called Kimri or Kimmeroi, and also Sake or Scythians, remained in Media and Persia long enough to fight in the armies of the empire, to serve in the failed invasion of Greece, and eventually a portion of them called the Parthians arose and dominated and ruled the empire. Finally, in Isaiah chapter 14, 1-2, we read that the Israelites would eventually become the dominant power. For Yahweh will have mercy upon Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob, and the people shall take them, and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of Yahweh for servants and handmaids, and they shall take them captives, whom captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. So when the children of Israel were deported by the Assyrians, the Medes and the Persians who were subject to them would have been part of their armies. So later, when the Qumri or Kimmeroi had migrated into Europe over the ensuing centuries, Diodorus Siculus explains that the Scythians had taken people of the Medes and Assyrians and forcefully replanted them on the Black Sea and along the Tanais River, which feeds it from the north. So the biblical prophecies, and especially those of Isaiah, put together with the classical histories, describe the beginning of the formation of modern Europe and the Germanic people, as well as the Western Slavs, since the Sarmatians are often identified with them. And now moving on to the second part, Isaiah chapter 41, 1-4. Here he proclaims a future prophecy of the coming of Christ, but speaks as though it has already happened, and it also refers to the ultimate destination of the deported Israelites. Keep silence before me, O islands, and let the people renew their strength. Let them come near, let them speak, let us come near together in judgment. Who raised up the righteous man from the east, called him to his foot, gave the nations before him, and made him rule over kings. He gave them as dust to his sword, and as a driven stubble to his bow. He pursued them, and has passed safely, even by the way that he had not gone with his feet. Who hath wrought and done, calling the generations from the beginning. I, Yahweh, the first, and with the last, I am he. So Christ was called to come to his people from the east. Christianity was brought to Europe from the east, and the apostles travelled to the lost sheep of the 12 tribes from Palestine and to the north and west. In other words, the Israelites were in Europe already. How else do we know that these islands are in the west, or islands could be translated as coastlands? Because Isaiah chapter 11:14, for example, speaks of the Israelites and says, "But they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west." However, the Septuagint says ships and not shoulders. But much more explicitly, at the very end of Isaiah, Yahweh tells us exactly where he would send the Israelites of the Assyrian captivity. For I know their works and their thoughts, and it shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. And I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape them unto the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, that draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the nations. All of those places can be identified, except perhaps for Paul. Paul only appears elsewhere as the name of an Assyrian king, which would make sense as the Israelites destroyed Assyria. Lud is the Lydians of Anatolia, but also in northern Italy, where they were called Etruscans in later history. Tubal was a Japhethite tribe originally on the Black Sea near the Caucasus Mountains, but later, along with Meshech, driven north through the Caucasus into what is now Russia by the Scythians. Javan is the Ionian Greeks of Attica and Athens, but they also had settlements along the Danube River and Marseille. Finally, Tarshish is Tartessus on the Mediterranean coast of Spain. Thus we see that within 300 years after Isaiah wrote, the Cimmerians and Scythians began appearing in and overrunning all of these places in western Anatolia, all around the Black Sea, Greece, northern Italy and Spain. So either we imagine that half of the Europe was overrun by non-white looking people sometime after Isaiah had written these prophecies of the Israelite destiny, or we can realize that the Israelites were the Germanic Cimmerians and Scythians, who were also called Sake, whose migrations into Europe were recorded by the Greeks and who were later called Galatahi, and by the Romans, Gauls and Germans. They were the ones who fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy about the destiny of Israel in Europe. 38. Daniel's Messiah timeline and the destruction of Jerusalem. Daniel gave the only messianic prophecy where there is explicitly a mention of a Messiah. Furthermore, he gave a precise dating of his coming, but also the impending destruction of Jerusalem, which would shortly follow after. And here Daniel very clearly states that the people of the prince, meaning the people of Christ, would be responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem, which can only be the Romans, who did destroy Jerusalem in 70 AD. The AntiChrists always make up excuses to get around this. Anything but the Europeans are the Israelites. A crucial part of reading this prophecy of Daniel is that we realize the ultimate purpose of the coming of the Messiah, why Christ had to come and what for. So here we shall read Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon the holy city to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So here we see that Christ has two purposes, one for his people and one for Jerusalem. The fate of the city would follow after the reason of his coming for the children of Israel. So firstly, to make an end of sins. Most Christians under universalism these days falsely believe that anyone can sin, and that Christ came to cleanse everybody in the world, or every believer, from their sins. However, sin is the transgression of the law, Yahweh's law. If you have not been given a law, then you cannot break a law. Only the Israelites were ever given the law. Therefore it should be obvious that Christ only only came to cleanse the Israelites from breaking his laws, which he gave solely to his people. Christ was the final sacrifice to cleanse the sins of his people, and he was the husband who released his wife from the penalty of death. Therefore, you cannot squeeze other people in here. As for to make reconciliation for iniquity, the transgression of the law is the reason why the children of Israel were cast off into captivity and divorced by Yahweh. Therefore, reconciliation between Yahweh and his wife can only be made with those with whom there was a relationship in the first place, and this reconciliation is therefore for them alone. How can another people be reconciled to Christ, to Yahweh, if they never had a relationship with him in the first place? As Christ himself explained, addressing the great day, the resurrection, to non-Adamics he'll say, and then I shall profess to them, that never have I known you. Depart from me, those who are working at lawlessness. He only knew the children of Israel. To bring in everlasting righteousness is what Yahweh had promised Israel in the words of other prophets. So for example, in Jeremiah, shortly after that promise of a new covenant, he says, and I will cleanse them from all their iniquity, whereby they have sinned against me, and I will pardon all their iniquities, whereby they have sinned, and whereby they have transgressed against me. And another example is in Isaiah, but Israel shall be saved in Yahweh with an everlasting salvation. You shall not be ashamed, nor confounded world without end. I have spoken in secret in a dark place of the earth. I have said not unto the seed of Jacob, seek ye me in vain. I, Yahweh, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right. Assemble yourselves and come, draw near together, ye that are escaped of the nations. They have no knowledge that set up the wood of their graven image and pray unto a God that cannot save. The phrase here, ye that are escaped to the nation, refers to the children of Israel who had survived the captivities and migrated out of the places to which they were forcibly resettled. And then a little later, look upon me and you'll be saved, all the ends of the earth. That's the children of Israel were to be scattered to the ends of the earth. For I am God, and there is none else. And then finally, in Yahweh shall all the seed of Israel be justified and shall glory. Next, to seal up the vision and the prophecy, with the coming of the Christ there would be no more prophets, as the prophecy is sealed. So Paul explained in the opening verses of the epistle to the Hebrews that in times past God communicated through the prophets, but now he speaks through the Son. And lastly, to anoint the Most Holy. Most Christians would instantly imagine this must be Christ, but he is actually referring to his people, the Israelites. The blood of Christ anointed his people and cleansed them. Thus the Most Holy is his people, the European Israelites. So overall, Daniel is connecting to this coming Messiah the promises of reconciliation and justification made to the children of Israel, which are found in the earlier prophets. Daniel spells out the precise purpose of the Messiah, and no other purpose can be attributed to him if it is not spelled out in the prophets, as Christ himself had said, that he came not to destroy the prophets, but to fulfill the things which they had said. Therefore you cannot say that Christ came to gather all other people of the world together, or Christ came for anyone who believes in him. And now concerning the time when the Messiah would appear and the fate of the city. So after explaining Jerusalem would be built up, and after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off, and not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Mainstream commentators are completely deceived and try to make this prince of the people who would destroy the city a separate prince from the Messiah the prince, which defies the natural meaning of the passage as well as the practical use of grammar. They are the same prince, and there is yet further evidence that the Romans were amongst his people, as history can demonstrate, and as the epistle of Paul of Tarsus to the Romans proves in many ways. So now to finish Daniel, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. As Christ told his adversaries, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And we have another verification of Daniel and of his purpose, and the city was destroyed along with perhaps 500,000 That's what Tacitus says, but as many as 1.1 million according to Josephus in the Judean wars with the Romans. So Daniel's prophecy happened exactly how it is written, therefore the purpose of the Messiah is also exactly how it is written. Christ only came for Israel, and the Europeans are those people. 39 minor prophets show that Yahweh only deals with Israel. There are 12 minor prophets in the Bible which were during the kingdom period of ancient Israel. Generally, they give short-term prophecies focusing on the sins of Israel and the impending punishment that will befall them. However, there were also many prophecies which would befall Israel at a much later time in the future, and it should become clear that Yahweh is exclusively focused on the children of Israel, whom he chastises to correct, whilst other surrounding nations he takes vengeance on whenever they cross Israel, his beloved wife. Thus we can see that Yahweh is only ever concerned with the fate of his people, and realizing that the later prophecies are still only dealing with Israel and that the Europeans only fulfill them, we realize the Europeans are the Israelites, and to Yahweh nobody else matters. Jonah was the earliest of the minor prophets. He was commanded to go to Nineveh in Assyria, but instead tried to jump on a ship to Europe, Tarshish, which is in Spain, to escape his obligation. At the time, the Assyrian Empire was just beginning its expansion into Syria, and perhaps a few decades or so later, the Assyrians would begin to invade Israel and Judah. Hosea prophesied from the perspective of Yahweh being the husband to his wife Israel, so we learn that the deportations are actually Yahweh divorcing his wife, but that Yahweh promises an eventual reconciliation or a remarriage one day in the future. Although he divorced all of Israel, all 12 tribes, he kept Jerusalem still to himself. Therefore we understand that Yahweh in the flesh, as Christ, was still married to the Israelites in Jerusalem and spread his gospel amongst the real true Israelites there. Then once he died, he being the husband freed his wife, all of Israel, including all of the rest of the 12 tribes he had divorced, and who were now scattered primarily in Europe. This way he could remarry them all, and this is the day we Christians all look forward to in the eventual Supper of the Lamb described towards the end of Revelation. And here we see that Yahweh is exclusively only dealing with Israel. There are no other wives. There is only a remarriage with the same wife. The European Christians must be the same Israelites he divorced. Amos prophesies the captivities of Israel and the desolation of all the surrounding nations. So here we see that Yahweh, as the vengeful husband, will destroy all those that did evil to his wife, the children of Israel. Although he always promises mercy to the children of Israel, we also get a confirmation that the deported Israelites did indeed go to the north in Amos 5:27. Therefore I will cause you to go into captivity beyond Damascus, saith Yahweh. The Israelites did not go to Africa or sail to the Americas or disappear into the Himalayas. They went to the cities of the Medes, where they became the Sake, Scythians, and many other names who migrated to Europe. Micah prophesies that although the Israelites were being deported and thus were being brought down low, they would eventually go stronger and stronger once again, ultimately to destroy their captors, such as in Micah 5:4, and he shall stand and feed in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh his God, and they shall abide, for now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth, and this man shall be the peace, when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces, then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds, and 8 principal men, and they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrians, when he cometh into our land, and when he treadeth within our borders. And then we read a little further on, and the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations in the midst of many people, as a lion among the beasts of the forest, as a young lion among the flocks of sheep, who if he go through, both treadeth down and teareth in pieces, and none can deliver. Thine hand shall be lifted upon thine adversaries, and all thine enemies shall be cut off. And this was fulfilled several centuries later, as all of the old empires of the East were ultimately overcome by the descendants of the Israelites, the Chimerians, Scythians and Parthians. Joel described the decay of the Israelite kingdom, which had become full of Canaanites and other evil peoples and tribes. He allegorically describes them as locusts, cankerworms, palmerworms and caterpillars, parasites essentially, which were devouring his people, just like a farmer watching his crop crops devoured by pest. Joel was watching his people being devoured. Today we have the same problem in all of our cities and nations, a punishment which would happen only to Israel if we turned away from Yahweh, which is exactly what has gradually happened in our Christian nations. Joel also prophesies against Tyre, where he states, "The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have you sold unto the Grecians." In Hebrew, the word for Grecians here is Yavanna, which is the Ionians, and not all of the Greeks. The Tyrians had sold captured Israelites, their own people, to the Ionians as well as the Edomites, which we also read in Amos. However, throughout all of Athens' history, all slaves were always white. The prophet Nahum also wrote a prophecy of the destruction was about to come upon Nineveh, which included a promise of the gospel, which is very similar to the one found in Isaiah chapter 52. Along with this, Nahum corroborates the captivity of Israel, where he wrote, "For Yahweh hath turned away the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel, for the emptiers, i.e. Assyrians, have emptied them out, and married their vine branches." So Yahweh would avenge Israel by destroying Nineveh, and the last chapter of the book reads in part, "Behold, I am against thee, saith Yahweh of hosts, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke, and the sword shall devour thy young lions, and I will cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard." So after the coalition of Cimmerians, Babylonians, Persians and Medes destroyed the city, Nineveh was never heard from again. Obadiah wrote his prophecy against Jacob's brother, which has still not been fulfilled to this day, so we await it still. And we find out that they were most responsible for the total destruction of the Temple of Solomon. Ironically, they later under King Herod would build a new temple, although they would now pretend to be the Israelites, and this continues to this day. Zechariah is a prophet not only for the time of the rebuilding, but he also describes some of the trials Zerubbabel, and namely the high priest Joshua, would have to face, and many things that would result after the rebuilding of the temple, and especially the ministry of Christ. His own travails with Satan, which is the descendants of Jacob's brother. Zechariah gave oracles against some of the surrounding nations, and one such prophecy was against the cities of Philistine. And it is recorded, "A bastard shall dwell in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines." At the time, the Philistines looked just like Europeans, and had also apparently interacted in trade with Europeans for a few centuries. But the people who live in those regions now must be bastards, as that is what the prophecy tells us. Clearly, a bastard is not what the churches teach us, a child born out of wedlock. Rather, it is non-Adamic people. The prophet Malachi is the last prophet, and he prophesies when the temple is fully rebuilt and operational. But the priesthood is corrupting itself. They are mixing with the surrounding non-Adamic people. And he was a prophet of Christ and of John the Baptist, the Elijah which Christ had said was already come. And he was also the prophet of the true Christianity which would come towards the end time. The Elijah whom Christ had said would come in the future to restore the true covenant message of the scriptures, that we Europeans are the Israelites. And that is the ministry that is unfolding at this point in time, to turn the hearts of the children to the fathers, and the hearts of the fathers to the children. In other words, make us remember who we are. So overall, the prophets make it abundantly clear the Israelites were deported to the north and eventually migrated to Europe, that the Israelites conquered all the other Adamic nations and received the Christian gospel to be restored to their former husband Yahweh, who is Christ. Furthermore, in the end times, a final ministry would begin to transpire, the ministry of Europeans remembering who they are, the Israelites of the Bible. 40. Revelation is only about the 12 tribes and is Eurocentric. The revelation of Christ foretells events that would unfold before the end of the world. Written by the Apostle John around 100 AD, it also reveals biblical mysteries such as the identity of the serpent in the Garden of Eden and the nature of the tree of life, also from Genesis. So when we study Revelation alongside the parables of Christ, we come to know the reasons and motivations behind everything that's transpired from the beginning of time. Once we understand the marital relationship between Yahweh and the Israelites, we realize that the woman in Revelation is the Israelites, but Yahweh had divorced his people, so she is no longer referred to as the wife, but as the woman. Whatever happened to the woman in Revelation would happen to the European Israelites. The revelation begins with Christ's messages and warnings to the 7 churches. Whilst these churches did exist, they were used as a type for all Israelites then and thereafter for all time. Simply put, the Israelites are the 7 churches. These churches represent what type of Christians we are and how we go about our lives. Understanding the Greek meanings of the names of the churches reveals how Christ sees us. 5 of the churches are criticized and 2 are not. The 2 not criticized are Philadelphia and Smyrna. Smyrna means anointed and Philadelphia means brotherly love. These names refer to Europeans who realize that they are the anointed Israelites and or those who have brotherly love and affection for their own kin. Christ specifically warns Smyrna and Philadelphia that Satan will surely come after them. Satan's goal would be to prevent us Europeans from learning our true identity and also from building the kingdom of God through brotherly love for our kin. The other 5 churches are criticized. Firstly, Ephesus. The name can mean appetite or desirable and represents Christians who leave true Christianity for an easier, more appetizing, filtered down version. Next is Pergamon. Pergamon generally meant fortress because it was the name of an ancient fortress within Troy. All of the elite and powerful would have resided here, and Christ warns this church that they will be surrounded by the adversary, i.e. the descendants of Cain, who will infiltrate all institutions of power, and Pergamon was commanded to resist the teachings of Balaam, and this refers to the incident where the Canaanites deliberately tried to seduce Israelites to mix. Israelites in positions of power and authority must be on their guard against this seduction and protect our people. Next are Thyatira and Sardis, which means heavenly sacrifice and precious stone. These churches were not criticized for wrongdoing, but were warned to stay alert and fulfill their Christian obligations, since either they have the gospel and the knowledge but are waning, or they have the knowledge but they can go either way. Thus they are a heavenly sacrifice and a precious stone. The Apostle James warned, faith without works is dead. So Christ is exhorting these churches to do good work and to not give up. Lastly, Laodicea means righteous people, but righteous from a worldly perspective. In other words, self-righteous. This church is neither hot nor cold. They know his gospel of God and claim to be Christians, but they care not for his will or his works. They seek and care for their material wealth, while they are really destitute of the treasures that matter most, those stored up in heaven. And the rest of Revelation reveals what will happen to these 7 churches, i.e. the European people. Then we have the events leading to the fall of the Roman Empire. At the time of the writing of Revelation, Rome ruled the world, and the progressive overlapping stages of its downfall are popularly referred to as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. In fact, all empires generally follow this same pattern. So the first horse is white, and the man on the horse is carrying a bow and wearing a crown. The white horse represents the early Roman Republic and its great expansion. The second horse is red, its rider carries a sword, and the red horse represents the bloody civil wars that resulted in the tyranny of the emperor. The third horse is black, its rider carried no weapon but instead scales, and the black horse represents temporary peace with no further military expansion, but it also represents the merchants and mass immigration flocking into the empire, resulting in mass inflation and poverty. The fourth horse is green, and its rider's name is Death. The green horse represents the sickness, the famines, and the gradual decay of the empire. These 4 horsemen reveal that it is inevitable that the merchants and their usury will come to dominate, that mixing will decimate the native population, and that the empire will begin to crumble. Then there is a great persecution of Christians, and these martyrs cry out for vengeance upon the empire. Rome begins to collapse as the Germanic tribes invaded. Allegorically, these tribes, Israelites, are moving mountains, and the former powerful men are hiding in fear of their lives. It is at this point that we have the sealing of the 12,000 from each tribe. This guarantees all 12 tribes will survive. Once again, since the Germanic tribes came to dominate the former Roman Empire and Europe, this prophecy must refer to the Germanic tribes and not believers or whatever garbage modern churches teach. The innumerable multitude mentioned next are those who went through the tribulation, and only the Israelites were ever destined to go through that. The tribulation started with the Assyrian deportations roughly 740 BC and would be a 7 times punishment of 360 years. Therefore, for 2,520 years, the Israelites lived under tyrannies as punishment for their sins. And this timeline brings us up to the beginning of the revolutions in Europe, roughly 1780 AD, which may have freed us, but we are now far worse off as we are in the time of Jacob's trouble, and we have been duped into throwing off the yoke of the nobility and kings, who are our own race, and we've become slaves to the descendants of Cain under the guise of democracy. As for the 12,000 from each tribe who were sealed, they seem to have a special destiny that is not yet revealed. One day we will find out. Next, the bottomless pit is opened. This is the rise of Islam, and it began in Arabia and wiped out 1/3 of the Adamic world. They are described as locusts with the power to sting for 5 months. If a day is a year in prophecy, then 5 months of 30 days are 150 years. The conquest took the Middle East and North Africa, which were former Adamic nations, and the conquest even encroached into Europe. Thus 1/3 of the Adamic world was wiped out, as the assaults lasted 150 years, just as the revelations predicted. The conquest then fizzled out and were largely stopped by Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours in France. However, another wave of conquest came, this time the Turks, who had now converted to Islam. They invaded from across the Euphrates River. Their wars against Europe would last longer, an hour and a day and a month and a year, which works out to be 391 days or years in prophecy. The crossings started around 1062 AD, and Constantinople fell in 1453, around 391 years later, although the wars would continue after the fall of Constantinople. Here we should see what Yahweh sees as a destructive force wiping out our people, the body of Christ, through conquest and mixing. Next we have the opening of the little book, which can only be the Bible. Mass printing of the Bible led to the common people having access to the scriptures, and this was a gradual process over the centuries, which the Catholic Church slowly becoming more tyrannical and eventually forbidding anyone from translating the Bible upon penalty of death. And this led to the rising of the Protestant Reformation and splitting away from the Catholic Church. Here Christ's 2 witnesses are revealed, who can only be Israel and Judah. They stood up and died in the name of Christ and his gospel, thus being his witnesses, testifying that he is true. Primarily Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, and Britain stood up, and the rest of Europe followed. Germany must be Judah and Britain must be Ephraim, the 2 leaders of the 12 tribes. Together with the 12 tribes, the Europeans led by Judah and Ephraim are Christ's 2 witnesses. Following this, we have a series of recapitulations or retelling of the previous chapters, but from completely different perspectives, and this can be confusing, but it gives further insight. We must remember that throughout the Bible, Hebrewisms and phrases that repeat the same idea multiple times in different ways in order to give greater understanding, and here in Revelation, the repetition is done with entire chapters. We see a woman with a crown of 12 stars fleeing into the wilderness, and this woman is the Israelites fleeing to Europe. Their migration started in the wilderness. The 12 stars represent the 12 tribes. The fleeing figure is a woman because she is the wife-to-be of Yahweh. She is to be nourished by the gospel, and the woman is described as birthing Christ, meaning that Christ was an Israelite. A dragon tries to kill Christ, and this is King Herod. He is a dragon because he is a descendant of Jacob's brother, the race of Cain. Whilst the serpent represents all the descendants of Cain collectively, a dragon represents one of those descendants of Cain who has become powerful and mighty. Today the dragons would be the powerful billionaires with enormous influence. Then we have another recapitulation explaining the deeper motivations behind these happenings. Just like at the dawn of time, Michael the archangel fought the fallen angels and they were kicked out of heaven. Likewise, Christianity resulted in the expulsion of the serpent and its dragons being kicked out of Christian Europe. The serpent attempted to destroy destroy Christian Europe by casting out a flood to destroy the woman. A flood is mixed people, therefore we realize the rise of Islam was planned and funded by the serpent to deliberately militarize all people out there to overrun all Adamic nations and eventually all of Europe. Ultimately, the woman is protected and the invasions fail and did not destroy all of Europe. Next we have another recapitulation, and things are described from the perspective of the continuous beasts which have been behind the empires that have come and gone throughout time. The 7 beasts include the 4 out of 5 empires described in Daniel: Babylon, Persia, Greece and Rome. However, here Revelation goes back further in time than Daniel's prophecies and also includes Egypt and Assyria, which were prior to Babylon, and that makes 6. Another 7th beast is predicted to come, and this 7th beast would come from a former beast, and this can only be the Roman Catholic Church, which came from the former Roman Empire and came to rule over Daniel's final 5th empire, which is Christendom. Overall, we come to understand that there are Adamic empires, but also nefarious descendants of Cain in the background who turned these empires into multicultural beasts who tyrannized the Adamic people. Then it explains the miraculous recovery of this new 7th beast. The fall of the city of Rome is the mortal head wound. With the rise of the papacy, the western part of the Roman Empire rose a second time, even more powerful than before, but this time under a religious tyranny rather than a military empire, and gradually all kings and nobles had to answer to the papacy and obey the Pope's decrees and laws. The popes are granted 42 months of authority, which is 42 times 30, which is 1260 days or years in prophecy. In 1796, Napoleon arrested the Pope and papal authority was ended, and in 576 the papacy had been created by the Emperor Justinian, who made the Roman bishop have authority over all other bishops and eventually over all of Europe. Next we have the rise of a brief empire which would come and go and would also result in the adversary being unleashed, and this is Napoleon's empire, which came and went in a matter of a few years, but by and large resulted in the complete emancipation of the descendants of Cain all across Europe. Although they were always infiltrating in the background and manipulating the kings and nobles, they did so by stealth. From this point on, they could finally openly hold positions and quickly came to dominate our people. Amidst all of this, there came from the mouths of the dragon, the beast and the false prophet 3 unclean spirits appearing like frogs. As previously stated, the dragons are the King Herods of the day, the rich descendants of Cain behind the scene. The beast is their political power, and the false prophet is the counterfeit Israelites. Practically speaking, they are all one evil entity working together. As for the 3 unclean spirits appearing like frogs, they can only be liberty, fraternity and equality, and this was the political propaganda that the descendants of Cain used to deceive the Christian people and to encourage the French Revolution and all future revolutions. It all started in France, and the French were called frogs for centuries leading up to these developments, and this gives us a clue about where this would happen and where it did ultimately happen in history. We then have one final recapitulation which sets in stone who Satan is. Here the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the false accuser and the adversary, is bound for 1,000 years, after which he is released for a short time. Simultaneously, we have a millennial reign of Christianity for 1,000 years, and this can only be Christian Europe. Europe or Christendom was virtually fully Christianized under the reign of Charlemagne and his Holy Roman Empire. He forced most of the remaining pagans in Europe to convert from around 800 AD, and Christendom lasted till around 1800 AD, when Europe became liberal. During this time, the descendants of Cain were barred from holding any public office, and in many cases were forcibly separated from Christians, and this lasted until Napoleon emancipated them and made them equal citizens around 1800 AD, and this was Satan being bound in a pit for 1,000 years and then released. It is then explained that this is the first restoration, as finally the divorced Israelites who had been scattered and wandered to Europe were reunited and restored to their God through Christ, and they are guaranteed 1,000 years of of Christianity. However, in most Bible translation, this is clouded and obscured because a line was added in between. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed, and this is the first restoration. Instead, this second phrase is often translated as this is the first resurrection, and this line is not in any of the older manuscripts and is in error. It has caused enormous confusion, and many Christians falsely believe that when Christ returns we are resurrected and go to heaven for 1,000 years. Only after that will Satan return and be destroyed. However, this has all already happened. Next, Satan, i.e. the descendants of Cain, are released with the emancipation. We gain a clearer understanding of history here and realize that they were behind all the revolutions to gain their freedom. It is then explained that they will spread across the world to deceive all nations and begin amassing all the other people to mass migrate and swarm into Christian nations. Is this not exactly what is happening and has been happening to our nations for at least several decades now? Finally, we are told it will all fail and we will prevail with Christ. The book of life is opened and only those written in it have a resurrection. The book of life is the Bible, which is the story of the Adamic people. If you're not Adamic, you're not written in the book of life. Thus only the Adamic people, God's creation, who have his spirit inside them, will ultimately be resurrected. Death and Hades are destroyed as the Adamic race is restored to its once glorious state before Adam fell, and therefore Hades is no longer needed to store the dead until the time of the resurrection. We then have heaven coming down to earth, and there is no longer a sea. The sea, or a flood, are allegorically used for non-Adamic people. They are gone now. A new Jerusalem appears. However, the Israelites are now this city, and Christ is the temple within. It has 12 gates, one for each tribe. We have a description of the river of life, which can only be the gospel of Christ, and the tree of life, which is Christ and his Adamic race. The tree of life has survived from the beginning, where it is first mentioned in Genesis, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil is not mentioned and is no longer found. This is because the enemies of Christ have been destroyed. Christ prevails and saves his people, the Israelites, as he promised. Thus, in conclusion, once we have a true understanding of the revelation, we can see it is exclusively about us, the European people. It is a continuation of the Israelites from the Old Testament in their new home in Europe under the sway of the Roman Empire, and what would happen to them from then on. Since every prophecy and revelation has been fulfilled and is written with several still to be fulfilled, we know that Yahweh's word and promises are all true. He will one day return to save us, and we should strive to obey his commandments and love our people. The enemy is trying to destroy us, but we will prevail in the end.